Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
Everybody knows what a petri dish is where things grow, good or bad. And culture is the petri dish of the company. So the culture is the petri dish. You can throw in anything and it will grow, good or bad. And therefore, the question is, how can we grow good things, please? But it's going to grow. It's not going to stay there. So the management, the petri dish to me is the culture. What you throw in will grow. And as simplistic as that may sound, is a very good analogy of understanding the fabric of the organization, what is underneath, which is what you want to change or modify or to shape. Then you can unpack that and say, well, we are talking about unwritten rules and we are talking about that and that and that and the other. But you have to start from the idea that what you are doing is to put things in a petri dish. And that helps quite a lot to say, okay, so what do you want me to throw in? Because that's the starting point of a reasonable dialogue about shaping things.
Hello, and welcome to episode 81 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.one/CultureBrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. More than half of HR leaders recently surveyed by Gartner on their 2022 priorities say that their employees are suffering from change fatigue. So why do people get so exhausted by change? Is it just the sheer volume of disruption that each of us faces in our daily lives? Or is it how we approach change and the change process? Well, my guest today says that change is painful and exhausting for many reasons, but one of the most important ones is that for some inexplicable reason, we insist on using a traditional linear approach to change, one that is completely outdated and ineffective in a complex and fast-shifting environment that we live in today. Leandro Herrero is a bit of a legend, actually, among culture geeks like me. He is the pioneer of viral change, a methodology that delivers large-scale behavioral and cultural change in organizations. And he helps companies create lasting capacity for adaptability and agility. The primary focus of his work is creation of cutting-edge organizational architectures that are based on 3 pillars: an enabling design, a mobilizing platform, and collective leadership. Today, Leandro and I chat about how you can create viral change within your organization and what are the 5 principles to follow to bring about successful and lasting culture change. So, without further ado, here is Leandro Herrero.
My name is Leandro Herrero, and I'm the CEO of the Chalfont Project. It's a UK-based organizational architecture consulting group I've been doing this for 20 something years. Before that, I was in drug development, in pharmaceuticals, and before that in medical practice, because I'm a medical practitioner by background, a psychiatrist. And I live in the UK now for the last 32 years, but I'm originally from Spain.
From Spain, wonderful. Well, one of the questions that I ask all our guests is what were the early cultural influences that shaped them as a person? So you grew up in Spain. Tell me a little bit about that environment and, what imprint has it left on you as a person?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a posteriori question. Obviously, what I can say is, as you mentioned, is that I have a mixture of so many things that by definition is shaping me systematically all my life, because I'm from Spain. I live outside of Spain. I lived in the US for a little bit. I'm a medic, but I'm not practicing medicine. I was a psychiatrist, but that is being brought to me for the work that we've done with organizations and in terms of the organizational aspects. I live in the UK, which is completely different culture now. Maybe I like the weather here. That's a joke that nobody believes me. So I think all that mixture, which is probably, I don't know, is the cause of the effect. I have no idea, but doesn't really matter, of my view of the world, which by definition is mixed and is not fixed.
Mm-hmm.
Is influenced by disciplines, by many things, and it has probably helped me to see the world the way I do. I'm not sure whether that's the case.
It's very true. But I love how lightly you hold your identities, how lightly you say, yes, I'm Spanish, but I don't live in Spain anymore. I'm a medic, but I don't practice anymore. So it seems like you've been open to new experiences all your life.
Yeah, I probably haven't stopped yet.
Yeah, I am sure you haven't. I am sure. Yeah, because I think these are some of the things that really accompany people throughout their lives. So I'm super curious to speak about your work and how that mindset manifests itself in your work and how you approach the discipline that you love, which is change. I want us to dive straight into it and ask with a question that a lot of our listeners would like me to ask, which is the following. You say in your book that most culture change efforts are slow, they're painful, and ultimately, of course, unsuccessful. So I'd like to ask, in your view, Leandro, what are the main reasons why so many genuinely well-intentioned change initiatives fail?
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually. And obviously, it will be very arrogant of me to say, and this is the answer. I'm sure there are many answers to that. But when you look at what has happened for the last, 40 years or whatever years, and how this is being promoted by particularly the big consulting groups and academia, there's always been an assumption that this monster called culture is something that is going to be very difficult to change because we are all resistant to change, which is absolutely nonsense. And also it's going to cost a lot of money, obviously, because they need the big consulting groups and 200 different consultants coming down from heaven to do things for you. So it's a perpetuation of a myth that is something incredibly complex. And the reason why it doesn't work or hasn't worked that well, the track record is not terribly good, is because there are many reasons, but I'll give you one or two, which is just one, which is that all of them, most of what we have until now, is being on one hand very linear. So you do that, and then you do that, and then you do that, and then there's the third step, and the fourth step, and the eighth steps. And that's ridiculous when you attack culture, which is a complex system. So the mental model for the beginning is wrong. Then the second part is that we have relied a lot on communication. By definition, if you look at many things that the traditional management change models have, is we'll communicate to people. Change is good for you. This is what we need to change. This is what you do. Do you get it? You understand? Let's have 20 workshops to understand change. And we keep bombarding people with information about that. That doesn't change anything. Communication is not change. Communication does not create change. And the perpetuation of these two and other things mean that when you put that together, we have lots of fireworks and lots of many consultants and many things, but in reality, the track record of actually touching the core of the organization and shaping a culture is not very good. It's as simple as that. And these things are still these assumptions are still there, less and less probably because many people, particular clients that I'm dealing with, some of them even young, or but not necessarily that young. It's the language of it must be a better way to do it. It has become a little bit more normal to hear because people have sometimes been part of one or two or three or four previous fiascos, and they say, well, this is not changing anything. So it's more difficult than we thought. Must be a better way. So that's hope there that people can see that there are different avenues to shape the change of and the culture of organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that I have exactly the same experience coming from, large consultancies like Hay Group, Conferry, PwC, where there was this point where you always started thinking, well, there must be a better way. It's just impossible that the only way that you can do that is, as you say, bringing in a team of 45 people and trying to sort of do it for the client. And then obviously when you leave them with the findings that you've handed in on 1,200 pages of PowerPoint printouts or whatever, nothing changes, obviously.
Yeah.
So what is the alternative to this approach? Because this is your life's work. This is where you focused all your efforts to really find this better way. What are your findings?
Actually, I haven't invented the alternative way. The alternative way has been there for a long time, which is social movements, where you start from the bottom and then you create a critical mass that creates a critical mass that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you need to orchestrate that. Obviously, it's not going to happen just by saying that. But it's a bottom-up approach that also needs the top-down communication systems. It's not one or the other. It's the synchronicity between the two systems. But historically, there's one of them that is being completely overdone, which is the top-down communication systems. And the other, it's been a bit of anecdote. Okay, yeah, people talk to each other and this a peer-to-peer thing, but we don't know what to do with that. What we do in viral change, which was what we created for the last 20 years, is the synchronization of these two worlds that we call in one of my books, World 1 and World 2. The World 1 is the world of communications, top-down. It's not going away, it's there, but it's not very effective, does not create change. And World 2 is a bottom-up. It's behavioral based, nothing to do with information. People do something, people copy, creates a critical mass, gets bigger and becomes the norm, good or bad. And obviously, you want that is good. It's the art and the system of synchronizing both things that is at the core of what I think is the alternative, which is viral change. Works very well systematically and actually shapes culture for good because it's touching the bottom or the middle or whatever you want to call it. I don't care the geography, but certainly is from everybody inside trying to work with other colleagues and other people, particularly peer-to-peer, and then create the change. And that is the basis of a social movement. So in reality, although that concept is alien to business in general, we are using it unapologetically in organizations and say culture is the creation of a social movement, and I'm in the business of creating social movements, as simple as that. And that's the alternative in a nutshell. Obviously, if you have another 20 hours, I will be very happy to explain to you the details.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to spend 20 hours with you chatting about culture. But I want to underscore what you have just said. So you say culture is basically social movement. Because I was going to ask you for your definition of culture anyway. So I think it's as good a moment as any to dive into it. So is this how you would define culture, a social movement?
Yes, in part, but there is another model that I use quite a lot, which is very biased because of my biological science background as a medic in medicine. It makes the analogy for me very, very easy to use, which is the Petri dish.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows what a Petri dish is. It's where things grow, good or bad. And culture is the Petri dish of the company. So the culture is the Petri dish. You can throw in anything and it will grow, good or bad. And therefore, the question is, how can we grow good things, please? But it's going to grow. It's not going to stay there. So the management, the Petri dish to me is the culture. What you throw in will grow. And as simplistic as that may sound, is a very good analogy of understanding the fabric of the organization, what is underneath, which is what you want to change or modify or to shape. Then you can unpack that and say, well, we are talking about unwritten rules, and we are talking about that and that and that and the other. But you have to start from the idea that what you are doing is to put things in a Petri dish.
I love that.
And that helps quite a lot to say, okay, so what do you want me to throw in? Because that's the starting point of a reasonable dialogue about shaping things.
I love Petri dish as a metaphor to really think what would be an effective way of shaping culture. And you come across to me as a person who really enjoys his work and is open to a playful sort of way of discussing this stuff. So I'd love us to play a little bit together and use a hypothetical scenario to explore the 5 disciplines of viral change that you talk about in your book. Are you up for it? Is it okay for me to share this hypothetical scenario with you, which is not so hypothetical because actually it is one of the organizations that I know. So let's imagine this scenario. You are in charge of a cultural transformation initiative in a large bank. And one of the changes that the senior leadership team has identified as a necessary cultural shift is to embrace customer feedback and even customer complaints so that the organization can improve customer experience. And this is partially driven by compliance. So there are some compliance issues where actually customer complaints need to be documented and then acted upon. But, you've invested a lot driving this cultural change. You set up systems so that people can document customer complaints and feedback. And unfortunately, in spite of all this investment of time and money and setting up all these feedback mechanisms and training, the adoption rates of this new behavior are still pretty low. And the customer satisfaction index doesn't improve either, especially not to the extent that the senior management would expect. So how would you approach this challenge using your approach, using the viral change principles?
It's a challenge that you put to me to describe that quickly. Thanks very much for the challenge. The first thing to say is that when you started describing what was needed and what they did, it doesn't sound to me, I'm sure there is other things, but it doesn't sound to me like a cultural approach. That sounds to me that they put process and systems in place to receive information, act upon the information, and then modify whatever needs to modify. So it doesn't sound like a serious attempt to shape culture. It's that people follow new procedures and taking care of documenting them and then maybe reacting and doing something. Okay, well, good luck. There is nothing there that has to do with culture. The first approach for culture, which is another way of saying, where would you start? Start is not the right word, but you can start in many places in a system. There is no obvious place to start. Sometimes you need to start wherever it is easier to start in a system, and the company is a system and culture is a system. But if you were to choose a place where to start the conversation, at least, for me, clearly is number 1 of the 5 pillars that you are mentioning in viral change, which is behaviors. So what are the behaviors that we need for this culture to change? And you can say, well, following the process. Well, that's a process. I mean, the behavior may be following the process, but what is the behaviors? Do I have to do something different? Do I have to ask different questions? Do I have to work with somebody that I didn't work before? So all this behavioral stuff needs to be unpacked in a very granular way, because to say that we are going to be more customer-centric or we are going to be more accountable or more responsible, this is language. It doesn't mean anything at all.
Yeah, it's super abstract.
At the end of the day, is what people have to do or not to do in a very concrete way. And that's the number 1 thing, starting with the researching, understanding, finding the behavioral element of the whole thing, which many organizations say that they do. But in reality, when you look at what they mean by these behaviors, they are not behaviors at all. They are processes, they are systems. They say, we ask people to be, or there is language, to be more accountable. Accountability is not a behavior. Accountability is a concept. I don't know, my concept of accountability and your concept may be completely different. So until we agree what we are talking about, what is that people need to do or not to do, that you are going to say that person is accountable, I'm going to say, no, it's not. But unless we get this conversation, everything else is completely language that doesn't get anywhere. So the behavioral side is number 1 that needs to be addressed. And we spend quite a lot of time sometimes in trying to find and understand what kind of behaviors are we talking about. Where is it that is there? This is a fault in many approaches in which the behaviors have become a bit of a language. Yes, it's there. And everybody says we have values and behaviors and the rest, but actually they are not granular enough to understand what these people have to do or not to do. And when it's not granular, people can say, yeah, I'm doing that. Yes, I'm accountable. Right. Yes, I love the customer. But there is no way to check or to understand whether it's happening or not.
So let's make it super practical for our listeners. So a couple of follow-up questions on this. Number one, how would you go about identifying these behaviors? And also if you could give us a couple of examples of what level of granularity are we really looking for in identifying these behaviors? So maybe a couple of examples.
It's a good question. So the how to reach this is a complex process that has to do with many things. I mean, sometimes we just start from zero, unlikely these days, because it's not the companies there sitting and people are scratching their heads and saying, what do we do? So usually probably there's a value system or there's a set of things or objectives or whatever people need to do and need to change. So there's always a starting point. But then there are some ways and different exercises, if you want to call it like that, that we follow to be able to say what is really underneath that and underneath that until you get to some level of granularity. That doesn't have to be perfect because sometimes there is no way you get stuck at something and say, I want that, but I don't know how else to describe it. So therefore, I'm a bit stuck with that. But the granularity that we're talking about is, it could be as simple and not necessarily universal at all. I'm not saying that it's universal, but as simple as a question that people need to ask all the time. So, for example, simple question, again, repeat, not universal. Can I do that better and different? Okay, that's like terribly simplistic question. But you imagine for a second that in a organization there are 1,000 people this afternoon asking the question, could I do that in a better way, in a different way, maybe in a faster way? Just the inquiry, just getting that normal, the same as saying good morning or say, let's have a meeting and there is an agenda, the questions there. So questioning, and there are millions of questions, is a good starting point and it's a good example of granularity. In other cases, it's something that people do. So I will do that in that situation, and this situation we will never do that. Okay, that sounds more like a little bit like a code of practice, but still it could be very granular and very behavioral. So we end up having a set of that could have a mixture of questions or no questions. Let's say you have 5, 6, 7, doesn't matter, of these elements. And that becomes what we call the currency of the change. This is what people are going to exchange, is that behavior people do or don't do, or will be rewarded and acceptable.
Who is usually involved in identifying these behaviors? Like in our example about this bank, who would you engage in a conversation? What sort of behaviors our customer service employees need to display and engage in order to increase our customer satisfaction index?
As many people as you want and as little as you want. So there is no rule there, meaning that obviously you want to have a representation of the organization to be able to test whether what you are trying to do is going to be understood or not. So traditionally, all these things have been cooked at senior level in the leadership team, meeting with a bunch of consultants and saying, okay, we have a new set of PowerPoints and everything. And then people close their eyes and say, okay, let's tell the organization that we have new values, new behaviors, new whatever. It's a very poor way of doing that. And people are still doing that all the time. In the other extreme, it would be everybody's asking everybody. Well, that's not realistic either, because in a large organization, you can't go that level. And also, I don't believe that it's a democratic process at all. Democracy has nothing to do with organization. That's a conversation for another day. So there's something in between. So sometimes we do the leadership teams, yes, of course, but we say, no, but you don't have all the answers. We go to some groups, other groups. So we pull around a reasonable amount, a number of inputs from different areas of the organization to be able to then start having a representation of what people think about. It's not a terribly sophisticated and scientific process, because what you want is to just have enough of the sense that you are not missing something, but you have to go very transversal, very low, very whatever. So not just bank on what the management teams and leadership teams say, which again, most of the time, that's how it is. Even if, you say, well, no, but we go down and we go to the managers and the team leaders. You still are in the hierarchy, and there are other 5,000 people that don't. So you need to find a formula that allows you to maybe a couple of months, 3 months, I don't know, depending organizations will have to spend more time to have a reasonable number of inputs that say, if we did that will change. And
almost like an algorithm,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then that will change and that will be an outcome for that. So you establish what we call, actually, you use the term, but I use the term social algorithm that they say, okay. And then a combination of that, I mean, it's not that you have 100% sure that you are right, but you have a reasonable position to say, if we did that, that's the kind of shape of organization that we want to achieve. If we were to put that in the petri dish, this is what we want to grow. And then you do, and then you try. And that's the starting point. I mean, there are lots of things that happen after that, but that's the starting point.
So, Leandro, one of the questions that our practitioners have and a lot of our CultureBrained community members is, when you go through this process, what is the number of behaviors approximately that you should be focusing on? Because people are very cognizant of the fact that you cannot do too many things at the same time. So what is your view on this? And from your experience working with organizations who do it well, what seems to be the formula, if there is any?
Yeah, that's a question that I really, really hate. So congratulations for bringing it up.
I'm glad.
Yeah. Because I think that is a complete red herring. People say that obviously for very good reasons, so I don't make light of that. But it comes from the assumption that because in managerial terms, when you are doing maybe a performance management, or you have a brainstorming, or you have something that we are told that that's the right way to do it in a management system, you have a priority of 10 things, and they say, let's prioritize. Let's take the top 3. And then the top 3, you have the top 3, and you cut the other 7 on the top 3. So you are used to this thing that tries to obsessively get something that gets small, because you have this idea that it has to be like that. Otherwise, people are idiots and they're not going to remember anything. That's a complete nonsense from a mind perspective and from a biological perspective. That doesn't mean that you're going to remember 300 things. Of course not. But the number of these currency elements, whether it's 3, 4, 5, 7, doesn't really matter, because it matters less than people think. Because what matters is that some of these elements are connected with another. So we have programs in which there are 10 behaviors. And people, 10 is too many. Well, which one do you want to cut? Because the 10 were there for a reason. And when you have, let's say, 10, which could be a number, it's obvious that the 10 behaviors are not going to grow at the same pace, at the same level, and the same thing. That's okay. Some of these will grow faster, better, bigger, and some of them may not, maybe because they are weaker or more difficult or whatever it is. That doesn't make them bad. Again, I wouldn't use 20, but I have no problem whatsoever with use 10, and maybe it's 5, maybe 7, depends on how they are articulated. For example, when we articulate that in terms of questions, one question leads to another question to another question. You can't stop asking questions. So whether you are reach 5 or 6 or 7 doesn't really matter, depending on the conversation. So translation, I'm absolutely not worried about the number of, because the number of comes from a branding perspective, management perspective. You have to have 3, you have to have 5. 5 is too many, 3 is okay. I use the joke, sometimes it's a joke, but it's reality. I say, we have 10 commandments. We don't have 7 or 5. There are 10. And Moses didn't go there, oh, for goodness sake, God, give me just the top 3, because the other 10 is too many. Actually, no, you're stuck with 10. So sorry, that's how it is. Baba, can we have a small version with 4? No, you can't. So that's the same here.
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong with the number, provided that you do the right thing with that later on.
Yeah, so thank you for clarifying that. And let's assume that then we have identified these behaviors, and in case of this bank, it's possibly that people are asking questions to the customers so that they know exactly what problems they had and document that in the system, So we have a list of desired behaviors. What is the next important principle that we need to be thinking about?
That's the really important question, because what you need now is a mechanism of growth of these behaviors. Let's assume that they have been identified, and they are clean, and they are nice, and they are there, and everybody understands. And how did you grow them? Because you had to throw it in the petri dish. Okay, so what is the petri dish? Well, the petri dish is the culture. We know that. Where did you start? Well, you could have different choices. One is to say to the organization, here it is, guys. This is what we need to do. And, these are the behaviors. Good luck. Bad idea. That's not going to grow. And if it grows, God knows what's going to grow. Okay, so what mechanism is the one that is going to give me the best chance of growing these behaviors inside the Petri dish? By far above every other mechanism is peer-to-peer. Is peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer is the weapon that we have in organizations that we haven't used that much for many, many years, and it's clear that it's more powerful than anything else. What my peer and I cook and decide to do spontaneously is dynamite because we don't have to do it. So the peer-to-peer is the strongest source of engine of change in an organization. But then you have also a second choice, which is to say, okay, well, I will just wait for that to happen magically. Bad idea, because it's not going to come from heaven. So how can you orchestrate that? Well, go back to social movements. You have to go model. You have to start with somebody who starts the whole thing. How do you start a revolution? Question, answer. Somebody starts a revolution. That's the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So who is the starting? Then you need to go to individuals who have some ability to start doing that we just said, which is not everybody in the organization. And here we have a third level of choices. The traditional one, which is, well, let's have volunteers. We ask people who want to start, and then we start. But that's okay. But volunteers is not necessarily a great model. Even people love that, because you could have a volunteer that, usually when you ask for volunteers in an organization, you get what I call chronic volunteers, people that volunteer for absolutely everything. But that doesn't make them powerful. What I want is a volunteer, if you want to use that term, that actually has the power of pulling other people around, copying them and working with them to start the revolution, which is to grow these behaviors. So the next question is, who are these people? Obviously,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So because if you fix that, you have a very high probability of success, because then you have a number of people, which usually is very small, who are in the model that we are using, which is the viral change. Because out of the models, in our model, they are highly connected people in the network. People who have the ability to pull, to connect for personal reasons, personality, whatever it is, lots of whys. But what you know is that you have Peter and John and Mary, these people are going to pull other people around, because people copy them, trust them, follow them, whatever you want to call it. So
Right.
you have to find these individuals, and
Mm-hmm.
you have then to call them to arms and say,
Yeah.
can you help us? And that's how the whole thing starts.
And something really worth underscoring here is that these informal influencers usually don't map as you would expect on an organizational sort of chart. So people who are formal leaders very often are not the ones who are those informal influencers.
Yeah, there is no correlation. There is no correlation, between
whatsoever.
the hierarchical system and the network of influence system. They may be, some people may be both. It's not one or the other, but there is no correlation. So when people sometimes in the past have say, okay, I get the message, we are going to have a bunch of guys which are the talent management pool.
Right.
Talent management pool has nothing to do with being an influencer. So we have to be very careful at which model to use to engage these colleagues, because they are precious, they are incredibly important.
So before we go to the process of engaging them, just a really quick question about the best way to identify them. Because obviously, if it's not so clear, especially not so clear to management, what are the approaches to mapping that network of informal influencers that really allows you to have a realistic view rather than, what we think we know?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the next question. So you have a spectrum of possibilities here. In one end of the spectrum, you have the very analog, not sophisticated, not scientific way, which is to say, do you have people who other people follow? I mean, you really ask the question, who are these guys who I can ask to help, because you know that if they are on board, other people are going to be on board. That's not terribly scientific, and actually, it's very difficult sometimes to implement, to follow. I mean, in the other extreme, you have the scientific approach, which is to use an approach which is called social network analysis, in which we map these networks, we map the influencers, we map who is connected with whom in an anonymous way. So it's very important to respect the anonymity. So you know that then there are hubs and groups and clusters in which these individuals are around another individual, and you have the ability to map these networks. Obviously, to do that, you need to tell the organization that you are doing that. So because if they are going to get some form of questionnaire of some sort saying, if you wanted to work with somebody who actually gets things done and you trust that will help you, who would you go for? I'm paraphrasing here, but that's one of the 15, 18
One of the
questions
questions.
that we ask. And then when you have that, the algorithms will do the magic and will put together where these individuals are and who they are. But all that is done in a blind way. When the system identifies these individuals, we go back, the same system go back still in an anonymous way, saying to John, you've been nominated by your peers to be one of these people who we were saying that we need to start shaping the culture. Would you like to be part of that? And if the individual say, that doesn't sound right to me, I don't like it, I don't know what it is, and by the way, I'm going to leave the organization in the next days, but people don't know. No, thank you. Okay, so the system will say, well, thank you very much. And we meaning ourselves, a consultants, management, anybody, will never know that that person has said no. But if he says yes, then the name is public to the system, and therefore public to the project team that we are working with, the small number of people inside. And then we start constructing a reasonable list of individuals who are follow the same pattern of highly connected in the organization and therefore highly able to influence other people for whatever reason. And that's where we start. So we have a pool of people which social network analysis and social network science will tell you that it's a relatively small percentage of the population, usually between 5 and 10% of the population in any big organization or medium-sized organization will fall into that category. So suddenly organization that you have 500 people, in reality you have 50 that they are the ones who really are going to cook the whole thing. Are these 50, some of them maybe managers? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe some are, some are not, but it's nothing to do with the hierarchy. They are who they are, and they have this power for who they are, not the job that they have. And that's how we do it.
So for our listeners, Leandro, your organization carries out that mapping for clients if they want to map their informal network. That is basically a relatively simple survey that people receive and answer, as you said, around 18 questions.
Yeah.
And then you get the map. Okay, fantastic. So once you have the map and once you know who are your 3 to 5% informal influencers, how do you engage them? How do you make sure that you create an environment where they can really make a difference? What is your approach there?
Well, you have to get them together and romance them.
I love that. Let's talk about romance.
Yeah, the romancing process starts here and say, hey, hands up, help, I need you. And the answer, why? Why me? And, the whole conversation is that, well, not because I say so, because your peers say that actually you are the person who has this ability. Really? Are you sure? They are wrong. So you have sometimes funny conversations about that. But being serious, you get them together at some point, and then you explain what the organization wants to do, what the role is. They have accepted already tacitly. Most people accept the idea of being part of something and is being nominated. Many people feel flattered and say, okay, I don't know what I'm getting into, but if my peers say that, okay, count on me. And then they discover progressively what needs to be done, which is to start the revolution on a peer-to-peer basis with other colleagues. It's as simple as that. I make it simple for the sake of this conversation. But they need to get together, because what you want is to create a community that is around that. It's not a community is artificially created, but eventually it becomes a little bit more normal. But that's the starting point. So getting these people together. We do that at the phase 3 that we call in our value change process, which we call engagement. And we use boot camps as a concept, and we put them in boot camps. These days it's virtual. In the old days it will be analog, and it could be hybrid and anything you want, but it's about getting them the message, they understand. And sometimes when we can, the first person in the morning to start talking is the CEO, and saying, first thing to say, thanks for being here, because you don't have to be. There is nothing in your job description that says that you are part of anything. And therefore you are volunteer, and even you don't know exactly what you're getting into, but you will discover. But thanks very much. So this acknowledgement has to be very well up front. And then we have usually between 2 or 3 days of going through the motions on how it works, what we need, and people can say, yes, I can do that, how that is going to work. So it's a complex process, but we all compress it in a period of time, which is the engagement time, until the community is formed.
Yeah.
And then your next question may be what you do with that. And I'll tell you, the thing that you don't do is to close your eyes and say, here you are, go to the world and evangelize. Good luck. I'll see you next year. Doesn't work. And by the way, this is how many people are doing. So even people get into that and say, well, I've just done, I just told them. You need to keep this community engaged. You need to nurture, support, engage, love, whatever, this community over a period of time, because it's not necessarily easy. But the good news is that it's a relatively small number compared with the totality of the organization. So complex as it may be, I'm dealing with 100 people, 200 people, maybe not to 3,000 or 4,000. So in reality, it's manageable, inverted commas. And that's how the next phase is called diffusion starts, with having all these conversations, and we support them, we track them, we bring stories into the system, so the stories accelerate the pace of change until we see that those behaviors are starting to be adopted and become more and more progressively the norm.
So I have a question about stories, but before I get that, I want to ask about perhaps some practices that you can share around engaging them in the long term. From personal experience, building a community and engaging a community can be quite challenging, especially if you want the community to be vibrant and active and engaged for a longer period of time. And so I can only imagine that for whoever is in that role in an organization, they definitely have a lot of work, and they definitely need some good practices to follow to have good results. So would you be able to share a couple of practices that you know that work in activating these people and then keeping them engaged over a long period of time?
Well, more than practices is define with them what the role is in practical terms. What am I supposed to do? So you are supposed to start conversations with peers, your colleagues, or people who are not in the room. It's not between you, and engage into something. And that something depends on what the behaviors are. So you, by the time, obviously the behaviors have already been defined, and therefore it's about saying we want to grow this behavior. We want people to do more of that. So you have to start that, and other people will copy you, and you can engage with these people in this way. So there is a bit of training, there is a little bit of role playing, there is a little bit of technicalities of how to do that. But remember that we are talking about a very particular and peculiar group, which is a very highly connected, highly trusted group within the organization. So there's not, these people are good themselves already, so they don't need a lot of explanation. If you say, I would like you to start engaging with 3 or 4 colleagues and talk about that and doing that, probably the first reaction is, sure, I do that every day. So you are already something there that is not, you are not asking to start rediscovering things and changing processes and systems and the house upside down. It becomes very natural to them. And then, yes, your comment is pertinent. You can't leave them alone. You need to help them. And there are different ways to do it digitally, that over a period of a few months, you're following them, you are listening to them, you give them some feedback on what things are happening, because we are measuring in parallel the adoption of this behavior. So you need a tracking system that says we are advancing or not.
How do you measure an adoption of a behavior?
It's very simple, actually, more simple than people think. You need to describe what is that you want to see, and then you ask people, are we seeing this, yes or no? That sounds a very caricature, but actually, when you have a set of behaviors, that's how it is. I mean, you say, I want people to do that and that and that. Are we seeing that? And people in groups, in whatever, say, no, we haven't seen anything like that. Or, oh, yeah, we are starting seeing these things. Or that has become the norm here. So I'm answering you in a very simplistic way. It's a bit more sophisticated than that. But in reality, there is not a priori metric system that is there sitting, waiting to be used. The system needs to be tailored to the organization, because you measure what is relevant to that organization.
I love
when people say, well, but we have a culture, a scale, or employee engagement system. That's nonsense. That's nothing to do with that. That is, you can use that if you want. Good luck. But what you need to do is to understand what is that you want to see, and then
measure what matters.
See if you see it. I mean, sometimes we use the language even, or the corridor, which is very helpful sometimes. Say, what do we want to see by Christmas? That doesn't sound like a terribly high-level managerial question, but actually, it is what it is. What do you want to see by Christmas? I want to see half of the people doing that. Okay, so that's what we're going to measure, etc., etc. So, in a caricature way, that's what it is. The metric system is created fit for purpose for the change that you want to create and the culture that you want to create.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I'm 100% aligned with you on that. Okay, so let's go to stories, because you've mentioned that part of this work is sharing stories. I'm suspecting, knowing your work, that when you talk about stories, you don't mean the heroic stories of glorious sort of successes and major milestones. So what sort of stories are we looking for, and what really makes an impact and pushes the needle or moves the needle in the right direction for people?
Oh, come on, you are cheating. You read my books.
Well, obviously, I told you already that I've been following your work for decades.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, so no, you're absolutely right. Storytelling has become an industry on its own. Everybody wants storytelling, and there are consultants doing storytelling as an expert. So, so it has become a little bit of commodity. But the kinds of stories that we are looking for in our storytelling system in viral change are very concrete. Are stories of adoption of these behaviors. So it's as simple as that. It all goes back to the behavioral side, meaning that maybe stories around about something that is being done in an heroic way, as you say, or something big, which is a very interesting story, but it's not telling me anything about the progression of the culture. So the stories I'm looking for are stories that it has happened there and there. As a result of using those behaviors, this thing is changed. So it goes back to the currency that we are using. Many other stories are okay as well, but people are bombarded with many stories of many kinds. So you have to be careful on what kind of granularity you need for the stories, and that's what we do. So we do some storytelling training, but again, our view of the storytelling is quite narrow. It's very precise type of story that we are looking for, which they're floating around anyway. So it's a question of how to capture them and then how to disseminate them to the entire organization, saying this is happening already. That's what the storytelling system does.
Yeah, totally. And I think there is this element of, I never thought about it this way until I read something from you or maybe watched your talk, where you talk about these stories having to be really simple and relatable. And this word relatable, I think, is really important, because people need to be able to see themselves in the story. And sometimes those glorious stories of incredible accomplishments are stories that people can't relate to.
Yeah, nothing to do with me. I mean, there are plenty of them in managerial life saying the CEO did that and we have acquired this company and that was heroic and we were about to. Well, okay, congratulations, but that's nothing to do with my job. It's nothing to do with me. So I like that, but I'm not advancing anything. So the story has to be transferable. The best story is the story that produces a reaction of people of the type, it could be me. I could do that. My team could do that. If you kind of promote this reaction, then you're fine, because it means it's going to spread, because you see yourself. Okay, I can do that. If the story says, well, the reaction is, well, it's very interesting and good luck to them and great to live in this company and we should all be very proud, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's a story, but it's not going necessarily to be something that I want my team to really to take. I mean, we could still be proud of the company, but that doesn't do anything to the adoption of the behaviors and the currency that we have. So that's why I'm saying is a very narrow view of what we do. But people tend to understand that well in general.
Yes. What is the next thing? What is the next principle and discipline that we need to keep in mind to make sure that this whole process is successful?
Well, the next one, as you know, probably is surprise, is leadership, because leadership has to be somewhere. But again, we take a little bit different view of leadership, because leadership here for us in the context of viral change is mainly, but not only, but it's a lot of the leadership that we are looking for is what we call and we define and we even trademarked, dare I say, many years ago, because it was important to have it, backstage leadership, which is the ability of the top leadership to lead from the back, not from the front, which is actually what people are used to with the PowerPoints and the workshops and everything like that. So what can I do as top leader that I have power, no question. This program is probably run because I have the money to pay for that. So I have the power. But the issue is not what I do, is how can I support these peer-to-peer networks of commitment and influence? Because if I nurture them, if I make sure that they can talk, do, relate to each other, etc., then I'm supporting the real engine of change, which is not me. Actually, my power is very limited. I have the power of money and control and things like that, which is great, but I have no power in the peer-to-peer conversations. I have no power in the informal organization, very little. I have no power in what we call world two, which is the world of the social change and the world of bottom up. So that leadership from the back is fundamental for everything to work. We don't say to the leaders, stop your leadership role. We never say that. It would be ridiculous. So leaders continue to be leaders in the traditional way, and you will have your management teams and your top-down systems using the behaviors of doing something, hopefully. But the main leadership that we need is to combine that, which is important but not sufficient, with the supporting of the peer-to-peer conversations. And how to do that? Again, we do some training sometimes. Some organizations click with that and say, okay, I know how to do that. I know you. I understand what you say. Other organizations need a bit more of training on that. Is a perfect model? No, I don't think. I think the model is good, but why say not perfect? Because people are so used to the traditional model of leadership, which is top-down, that it's very difficult sometimes to say, actually, that's not going to work here, but we need to do something more. It's not that you are less leader, it's that you are more because you need, on top of what you are doing, to support the invisible organization, the peer-to-peer conversations, the community of champions, which is sometimes how we call this group. So there is an engine there that they need to know at the very least that you are behind them. At the very least, you will go and ask them from time to time, do you need anything? The chances are they say, no, thank you. We are already doing what we need to do. But it's how can we shape and support without interfering? Because that top-down system has no power, real otherwise, in controlling what's going on in the peer-to-peer conversations. That's why we have a project team that is sitting there underneath and is managing these connections between one world and another. Obviously, that doesn't happen just closing your eyes. We have a system to make these things work. But that's the principle, and that's the fifth discipline of viral change.
Wonderful. So we've managed to go through all five, and that's an amazing accomplishment. I really wanted for our listeners to be able to hear from you what these disciplines are. And now I want to invite you to move to the rapid fire questions. And the idea is that I'm asking you 5 questions in rapid succession, and your task is to answer all these 5 questions in under 2 minutes. Are you up
That's
for it?
an impossible task for somebody with a Spanish passport.
I love that. Well, let's see. Maybe we can pass the Smith. Who knows? I'm going to ask questions and let's see what happens. So the first question is, what is the sign or perhaps multiple signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
That's really difficult to answer. I'm serious about that in 2 minutes or even 5 or even more, because I don't think there is one sign. I think that like any biological entity, you can symptoms of anything. You can have fever, and then you have pain, and then you have something else, and you still don't know what's going on. What you need is, is that something is wrong, and therefore you need to do something about that. There are no specific symptoms that say, if you see that, then you have to do something. It doesn't work like that in organizations. What happens, however, I'm going to try to answer, but I'm not sure about the 2 minutes, is that there are sometimes more subtle and less dramatic problems that the organization present with, that people don't pay attention too much, but they are a sign of deterioration. And that's what we call the broken windows, which is part of the broken windows theory, which is things that are just not quite right. People don't attend meetings sometimes, or don't follow instructions, they don't follow the minutes. So it's all kind of falling apart, but it's nothing dramatic as to say, oh my God, this is falling apart. No, because it's not, because it's running and the organization is making money, etc. But that is to me a sign that is something there that probably is more profound than the symptoms, a broken window situation. That is one of the things I look for.
Okay. And are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
That's a trap question. And you have a series of questions. They all of them have their own flagging system. It is impossible for me to say that because it shouldn't be. Well, I mean, everybody's entitled to think whatever they want, but the idea, as we have for many years, say, well, you have to be Google or you have to be Apple, you have to be, I don't know, anything like that, etc., because they are good. It's completely nonsense. You will never be that because this is not your ethos. This is not what you are. So you can borrow and steal ideas from different places, absolutely, but sometimes you steal 10% or 5% because the rest of the things don't work for you. So I am deeply against the most admired thing of this is the perfect culture because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. You have what you need, or you need what you need to have what you need, and that allows you to look around and shop around and understand. But my strong recommendation is that if you want to copy Google, the best thing you could do is to apply for a job in Google.
And are there any books on culture, on leadership, or any other books that you would recommend to our listeners?
Is that a promotion of my books or no, not necessarily? No, I'm joking. Don't worry. I mean, I have.
Well, we are definitely going to promote your book and
fine,
put links to your books in the show notes. But aside your books, what else do you think our listeners should be reading?
I don't know, because again, for many years, I've been reading almost everything that is there. And these days, I read almost nothing that has to do with traditional leadership or management or anything like that. I find it that there is nothing new to say. And I'm reading more and more things that have to do with social change, sometimes with politics, whether I like them or not. For example, in the area of leadership, just speaking up because I knew you were going to ask me this question, but in the last years, I've been reading a book which is not good or bad. It's just one I read that has to do with the days of Obama in the White House, written by one of the advisors, Ben Rhodes. The title of the book is something to do like the world as it is. He wrote a second book after that, which is more boring. And why is that good? Because you just really see the realities of the dynamics of the leadership and non-leadership. So I recommend to look into things more than say another theory of leadership or another theory or something like that. I'm just exhausted of the literature of leadership and things like that. And in the area of change, the same. There are books that have to do with neat social changes that have been created, which sometimes they are very far away from your organization, but just makes you think that there is something there that has to do with the human condition that you want to read. So my recommendation is not to be stuck on traditional management books.
Yeah. And final question.
Other than mine, by the way.
Other than yours.
Mine are not traditional at all. So
final question in this series. What is one thing that our listeners can do literally tomorrow to build their own culture lab and to start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
I'm afraid I have to go back to the beginning, which is that nothing is going to happen unless you have clarity about the behavioral fabric that you want to have, whether you call behaviors social algorithms, as you said, or anything. But what is the granularity? What is the question is, what is that people need to do or not to do for these things to change and then go from A to B or whatever it is. So if you want to start somewhere, spend more time on the behavioral side and say, what are the behaviors? What is that people, what are they, anything else is starting with the wrong foot. Because that, if you start like that, it will lead you to another thing. So, but it's a good question, and it's rich, but you need to treat it seriously, because again, you can always put a few words in a piece of paper and say, well, I've got the behaviors, but that's not work. But I would recommend that you go back to the beginning of this long conversation on what the granularity of what is underneath what we have to do, and what is that you eventually want to throw in that petri dish. Because when you throw this, is where it's going to go. So you better spend time knowing what is that you want to use, because that is going to help you, no question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. So if our listeners want to learn more about you, about your work, about what your company does, what are the best online places to go to?
Well, we have several online places, but we have the main site and the main repository of the company's The Chalfont Project, and you will If you Google that, you will get the cellphoneproject.com, one single word, that's the name of the company. Viral Change in itself has its own repository and its own area, viralchange.com. You can see there as well more related to change. The cell phone project is more generic. And then there are other things that you will find if you Google that, or you Google me, and then you will find a way to get from one another. So I'm sure you will find me, no question. I'm completely findable. And then you can have a conversation with me or my team or anything, or no conversation at all. But I think that's the way to start, because it's in the public domain, most of the things that I'm discussing here.
Yeah. Leandro, I want to thank you again for the work that you are doing. I really appreciate you. It's been incredibly influential for me, and I'm super grateful. So thank you, and thank you for being here.
Thanks very much. Thanks to you.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Leandro and I hope that it will inspire you to think broader about how to drive culture change in your company. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with Leandro and other guests in live interactive sessions where you can pick their brain and learn more on the topic, this is just one of many benefits you'd enjoy if you were a member of the CultureBrained community. CultureBrained is a one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 to tiny startups on a rapid growth trajectory. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join if it feels like the right fit for you. You can learn more at tiny.one/culturebrained. You'll find the link in the show notes. And now, a quick preview of the upcoming episode. My next guest is Rohini Anand. Rohini is perhaps most well known for Sodexo's remarkable global culture change, led by diversity and inclusion, that was featured in a Harvard Business School case study. So she was SVP Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer for Sodexo, reporting to the global CEO. And she recently published a wonderful book called Leading Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. In this short snippet, you will hear her talk about why leaders need to change to drive change.
I think the one thing that we can all do is to examine our own biases, our own presumptions. I think we all have to work on our own DEI journey in order to transform cultures and others. And what that takes is making ourselves vulnerable, staying humble. And in my book, there are many stories that I share about my own journey, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have evolved, and my own missteps and lessons learned, because ultimately we're all a work in progress. And if we're going to transform cultures and transform people, we have to first work on ourselves.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/Aga Bayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.